April 18, 2019. A Dallas charity gala. A woman walks in hoping to find love. She's about to find her grave instead. His name was Blake Foster. He'd already killed 3 women. Evelyn Winters would be his 4th, and she didn't even know she was dancing with a killer. In the months that followed, nobody saw it coming. Not her friends, not her colleagues, not even her own daughter, a police detective, could stop what was about to happen. Because Blake Foster had perfected the art of making women disappear. Not just from this world, but from ever being suspected. This is what happens when charm becomes lethal. When ambition meets exploitation. When the man who says he'll love you forever is actually counting down your final days. Welcome back to True Cold Crime Stories HQ, where we revealed and exposed the uncovered case that will test everything you believe about human nature and crimes that will disturb your understanding about how crimes are committed. Please take a second to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification ring so you can never miss a new case. Let's move into it. Evelyn Winters had spent 38 years building something remarkable. Starting in 1981 with nothing but an apartment and an idea, she built an interior design empire in Dallas from the ground up. No investors, no connections, no safety net. What she had was a vision. She understood how space could transform lives. She understood that the right color, the right texture, the right light could turn a house into a home. By 2019, her company was worth over $12 million. She had designed interiors for some of Dallas's most prestigious homes. Luxury residences that appeared in national magazines. Corporate offices where decisions that shaped entire industries were made. Her name was respected. Her eye was legendary. Other women in their 60s were planning retirement parties. Evelyn was still working 60-hour weeks, still pushing, still proving something to herself that she couldn't quite name. But success had a cost that no amount of money could repay. Her marriage had dissolved quietly around 1996. Not in anger, but in silence. Her husband wanted her presence. She was offering him her ambition. By the time they signed the divorce papers, there wasn't much left to divide except the business she'd built. Their daughter, Clara, had learned early that her mother's love language was achievement. When Evelyn came home at night, she brought stories of clients and contracts, not cuddles and conversation. Clara grew up fast in that world. She became independent, self-sufficient. She learned not to need her mother the way other children did. By 2019, they spoke maybe once a month. Brief conversations about nothing in particular. There was love between them, but it lived on the surface. Nothing deep. Nothing that required real presence. Evelyn's home in Highland Park was exactly what you'd expect from a woman with her taste. High ceilings, original hardwood floors, art on the walls that cost more than most people's cars. But at night, when she came through the door after another 14-hour day, that beautiful home was just space. Quiet space. Empty space. She would pour a glass of wine, usually a Pinot Noir, always from the same vineyard in Napa that she'd discovered years ago. And she would sit by the window and watch Dallas light up around her. The city glittering in the darkness. Full of couples and families and people who had chosen connection over ambition. She never said it out loud, but something had shifted in her thinking by the spring of 2019. Time felt different at 60. Not in a way you could measure or explain, but in a way you could feel in your bones. The feeling that you'd made all your choices, that the game was nearly over, that maybe, just maybe, you'd won everything except the one thing that mattered most. When the invitation arrived for the charity gala on April 18, 2019, Evelyn almost didn't go. These events were obligatory. She would make an appearance, she would write a check, she would talk to people she'd talked to 100 times before. But something made her decide differently that year. She called her stylist. She had her hair done. She selected a dress, navy blue, elegant, the kind of dress that said she knew who she was. That evening, as she was getting ready, she caught her reflection in the mirror. And somewhere deep inside, she whispered a question she'd never allowed herself to ask before. What if it's not too late? The Dallas Fairmont hosted the gala that Thursday night. It was a benefit for a children's hospital. The kind of event where wealthy people gathered to feel good about themselves while drinking expensive champagne. The ballroom was filled with the usual crowd. Women in designer dresses, men in tailored suits. Evelyn arrived at 7:45 in the evening and moved through the room with the confidence of someone who'd been doing this for decades. She was talking to a potential client near the bar around 8:15 when she first noticed him. He was standing alone, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit him perfectly, watching the room with an expression that suggested he was observing something fascinating. He was 33 years old. His name was Blake Foster. He had very kind eyes. When their gazes met across that crowded ballroom, he smiled. Not aggressively, not presumptuously, just a small acknowledgement. A recognition of another person in the crowd. Evelyn turned back to her conversation, but her attention had fractured. By 8:45, Blake Foster had made his way over to her. He was graceful about it, casual. He didn't ask if he could join her conversation. He simply stood beside her, listening, smiling at the right moments, and somehow making it feel like he'd been part of the group the whole time. When the potential client excused herself to get another drink, Blake turned to Evelyn and said something simple. "I've been watching you all evening. You have a way of making people feel heard. It's rare." Evelyn, who had trained herself never to accept compliments without deflecting them, found herself just saying thank you. Blake asked her name. She told him. He said his name was Blake, and that he was an entrepreneur trying to find his footing in Dallas. He asked her what she did. She told him about her design firm. He listened, really listened, the way people listen when they're genuinely interested in the answer. For the next hour, they talked. He told her he'd had a difficult childhood, that he was trying to build something meaningful. He asked her about her journey. How she'd started with nothing, how she'd succeeded in a male-dominated field. He seemed impressed. He seemed genuinely moved by her story. When the event ended around 11 that night, Blake asked if he could have her phone number. She hesitated for exactly 3 seconds, the last moment she would have any power over what came next. Then she gave it to him. As she drove home through the Dallas darkness, Evelyn Winters felt something she hadn't felt in 23 years. Hope. She didn't know that Blake Foster had chosen her that evening, the way a hunter chooses prey. She didn't know that he'd already done this before. She didn't know that his kindness was a performance he'd perfected across multiple states and multiple identities. She only knew that for the first time in a very long time, someone had really seen her. Clara Winters had come back to Dallas in late March of 2019. She'd been living in Houston, working for the Houston Police Department as a detective. She was 28 years old, intelligent, and trained to notice inconsistencies. A month before Blake Foster walked into her mother's life, Clara had experienced her own loss, a romantic relationship that had ended badly, a betrayal that had made her question her judgment about people. She'd taken leave from work and come home to process it. She'd expected to stay a few weeks, but when she arrived at her mother's house, she found something unexpected. Her mother seemed different, more open somehow, more willing to talk. For the first time in years, they were having actual conversations. Clara stayed longer. By the time Blake Foster appeared in early May 2019, Clara had begun to rebuild her relationship with her mother. They were making plans to have dinner together, to actually spend time as adults. Then she met Blake. It was a Tuesday, May 7, 2019, when her mother mentioned that she'd met someone at a charity event. Clara's detective instincts activated immediately. A 33-year-old man interested in a 60-year-old woman. The timeline was already moving fast. By May 7th, they'd been seeing each other for less than 3 weeks. Yet Blake had somehow become present in Evelyn's thoughts constantly. When Clara finally met him in person, at a casual dinner, her mother suggested she noticed things that Evelyn couldn't see. The way Blake was always positioned close to Evelyn, the way he monitored her interactions with others, the way he seemed perfectly calibrated to every moment. Too perfect. Nobody is that consistently kind. Nobody is that attentive without purpose. Clara sat across from them at Nobu in Dallas's Uptown district that evening, and watched her mother look at this man the way she'd never seen her look at anyone before. With hunger. With hope. With the kind of vulnerability that made Clara's stomach tighten. After dinner, when Blake excused himself to take a call, Clara asked her mother directly. "How much do you really know about him?" Evelyn's answer was simple. "He makes me feel like I matter." That was the moment Clara knew her mother was in trouble. Not because Blake seemed dangerous, he seemed wonderful, but because her mother was so hungry for love that she would accept any story he told her. She would rationalize any inconsistency. She would override her own instincts because the alternative, another night alone, felt unbearable. By the time Blake returned to the table, Clara had made a decision. She was going to be watching him very closely. She didn't know yet that watching wouldn't be enough. She didn't know that her mother had already made her choice. And she didn't know that this man had done this 4 times before, and every single time his wife had ended up dead. By the 3rd week of May 2019, Blake Foster had become a permanent fixture in Evelyn Winter's life. What had started as a chance encounter at a charity gala had transformed into something that consumed her thoughts, her schedule, and increasingly, her judgment. The phone calls came late at night. He would ask her to tell him about her day, and then he would listen, truly listen, in a way that made her feel like the most important person in the world. On May 19, 2019, she texted her assistant that she'd be working from home because Blake was stopping by to bring her coffee. Her favorite coffee. The kind from a specific cafe in Deep Ellum that she'd mentioned once, offhandedly, 3 weeks earlier. He'd remembered. That detail, that small act of remembering, triggered something in Evelyn's brain. It told her that he was paying attention. That he cared enough to structure his life around surprising her. What Evelyn didn't understand was that Blake Foster had been taking notes, literally. In a small leather journal he kept in his apartment at the Crescent, a luxury complex in uptown Dallas, he'd written down her preferences, her insecurities, her dreams, and her vulnerabilities. This wasn't love. This was intelligence gathering disguised as affection. The courtship that unfolded across May, June, July, and August of 2019 followed a precise pattern that Blake had perfected through 3 previous marriages in 3 different states. He engineered what appeared to be coincidental meetings through meticulous research. On June 2, 2019, Evelyn mentioned to Blake that she was attending a design and architecture conference at the Hilton Anatole in Dallas. It was a Sunday morning conversation over breakfast at her place. Blake listened carefully and nodded. He seemed interested, but not overly invested. What Evelyn didn't know was that 2 hours after leaving her apartment, he purchased a conference ticket online under a business name. On June 2nd, when Evelyn arrived at the conference around 10 a.m., Blake was already there, registering at the business seminar happening in an adjacent ballroom. When they ran into each other during lunch, he acted genuinely surprised. "Evelyn, what are the odds?" he said, touching her arm lightly. "I've been meaning to attend this seminar for months. I had no idea you'd be here." The coincidence felt magical to her. The reality was calculated. On June 15th, Blake showed up at a gallery opening she'd mentioned to him in passing weeks before. She'd said she wanted to see an exhibition of modern interior design installations at the Crow Collection of Asian Art in Uptown. Blake arrived with the first edition of a design book she'd said was out of print and impossible to find, a book by Arne Jacobsen about modernist design philosophy. He'd spent hours tracking it down through rare book dealers online. It had cost him $230. When he handed it to her, he said simply, "I remembered you talking about how much you loved Jacobsen's work. I thought you should have this." She felt chosen. She felt seen. She felt like someone had finally decided she was worth the effort. His compliments were surgical in their precision. They never addressed her physical appearance in ways that felt superficial. Instead, he said things like, "The way you talked to that client yesterday showed such wisdom. You didn't just design a room for them. You designed the life they wanted to live inside that room." He praised her intelligence, her resilience, her independence. The very qualities that her ex-husband had resented became, in Blake's retelling, her greatest strengths. When she worried aloud that she was too old for him, too set in her ways, potentially too demanding, he responded with words that seemed custom-built for her specific fears. "You're not old. You're experienced. You know who you are. Do you understand how rare that is?" Most people spend their entire lives trying to figure that out. You already know what you want. You already know your value. That's one of the things I love most about you. He was speaking directly to her deepest fear, that her age made her undesirable, and transforming it into something she could feel proud of. The manipulation was seamless, because it didn't feel like manipulation at all. It felt like finally being understood. By mid-July, they were staying at each other's homes regularly. Blake had a small apartment in Uptown, nothing fancy, which he said was by choice because he wanted to invest his money in experiences rather than things. He was humble about his background, sharing stories that seemed designed to create emotional resonance. He told her about his mother who worked 2 jobs, about growing up in poverty in Oklahoma, about learning early that the world didn't owe him anything. These stories were fabrications, but they served a purpose. They made Evelyn feel like he understood struggle, like he understood the value of building something from nothing. They created a false sense of kinship and shared understanding. They positioned him as someone who could relate to her journey. In late July, he began introducing conversations about the future in ways that felt natural and organic. "Where do you want to be in 5 years?" he asked her one evening as they lay in bed in her Highland Park home. When she said she wasn't sure, that maybe she'd travel more, maybe she'd finally slow down and enjoy what she'd built, he said, "I want to do those things with you. I want to wake up next to you for the next 50 years. I want to build a life with you where you're not always working, always pushing, always proving something. I want to be the person who gets to love you while you finally enjoy your own success." The future tense planted a seed. It made her imagine a life that extended beyond her retirement years, a life with him in it, a life where she didn't have to be alone. The physical intimacy had developed at precisely the right pace. Not too fast, that would have triggered her defenses. Not too slow, that would have allowed her mind to catch up with what her heart was doing. It was perfectly calibrated. He was attentive to her body in ways her ex-husband had never been. He touched her like she mattered. He whispered things that made her feel desired and protected simultaneously. He knew when to be gentle and when to be passionate. He knew how to make her feel like the only woman in the world. By August, when she thought about the future without him, she felt a kind of panic that she'd only read about in novels. She was addicted to him in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying. She was dependent on his attention, his affection, his constant reassurance. She had become, without fully realizing it, emotionally enslaved. Clara could see it from the outside. By early August, when Clara met with her mother for lunch at Café Momentum in Highland Park, she watched Evelyn check her phone 7 times in 30 minutes. She was waiting for Blake to text her back. Her mother, the woman who had built a multi-million-dollar business, who had trained herself to be independent and self-sufficient, was now anxious about the attention of a 33-year-old man. Clara tried again with directness. "Mom, I ran a deeper background check on Blake. There are some inconsistencies in his story. His previous addresses don't match what he told you. His employment history is vague. I can't find verified records of any business he's actually owned." Evelyn set down her fork and looked at her daughter with an expression that Clara would never forget. It was a mixture of annoyance, sadness, and desperation. "Clara, I appreciate that you care. But I'm tired of being alone. I've spent 38 years building a business. I've built a life of achievement and success, but I've done it alone, and I'm tired of that. If you can't be happy for me, I need you to at least stop trying to convince me he's something he's not. I'm a grown woman. I can make my own decisions." The conversation ended with tension between them. Clara felt unheard. Evelyn felt judged. On September 6, 2019, Blake took Evelyn to dinner at Rosewood Mansion on Turtle Creek, one of Dallas's most exclusive and romantic restaurants. The evening was perfect in the way that only very carefully planned evenings can be. They sat at a private table overlooking the manicured gardens lit by soft evening light. Candles flickered between them. Blake had reserved their table weeks in advance. He had ordered a wine that he knew she loved, a 2015 Napa Valley Pinot Noir from the same vineyard she'd mentioned months ago. The service was impeccable. The food was extraordinary. Midway through the main course, as Evelyn was talking about an upcoming project, Blake reached across the table and took her hand. He waited until she finished speaking. Then he said the words she'd been hoping to hear. "Evelyn, I know we haven't known each other very long, but I also know that life is short and unpredictable. I don't want to waste another day not being clear about how I feel. I'm in love with you. I've never felt this way before. I want to marry you. I want to build a life with you. I want to be the man who gets to love you for the rest of our lives." She felt tears form in her eyes. This was the moment she'd thought would never come again. She was 60 years old, and someone was choosing her. Someone was saying she was worth the risk. The age gap, the whirlwind timeline, her daughter's concerns, all of it felt small compared to the relief of not being alone anymore. When he pulled out the diamond ring, a 2-carat solitaire in a platinum setting, she said yes before he could even ask the question formally. She said yes with the kind of certainty that comes from desperation. She said yes because she couldn't imagine saying no. She said yes because she'd been waiting decades to hear someone say those words, and she wasn't going to let logic stand in her way. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Blake, yes to everything." The wedding was small, exactly as Blake had insisted. He wanted it to be intimate. He wanted it to be just for them. A Sunday afternoon ceremony on October 12, 2019, at a private venue called The Jewel in downtown Dallas. The space was elegant and minimalist. Only 30 people attended. Clara was there, sitting in the third row, watching her mother marry a man she'd met 5 months earlier. Beside her sat Evelyn's business partner, Margaret Chen, a woman who had been with Evelyn since 1984, since the very beginning of her career. Margaret leaned over and whispered to Clara, "I've never seen her like this. She's happy, really happy." Clara didn't respond because she didn't have the words. She was watching her mother walk toward a man whose background didn't add up, whose timeline seemed orchestrated, whose charm seemed practiced and perfect. But she was also watching a woman who had earned the right to make her own choices, even if those choices looked like mistakes to everyone else. Blake stood at the altar in a custom-tailored charcoal suit, his expression perfectly conveying love and commitment. His vows were beautiful and specific and devastating in their dishonesty. "Evelyn, you've taught me that strength isn't about how much you achieve or how much you accumulate. It's about the grace you bring to the people around you. It's about the way you make people feel valued and important. I promise to spend every day proving that you made the right choice, trusting me with your heart. I promise to love you with everything I am." The guests wiped away tears. Even Clara felt a moment of doubt. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe Blake was exactly what he appeared to be. Maybe she was letting her detective's paranoia poison something genuine. Maybe love really could be this fast and this perfect. As they exchanged rings, Blake slipped a diamond band onto Evelyn's finger and leaned in to kiss her. The photographer captured the moment. They looked like every other couple celebrating their love on a beautiful October afternoon in Dallas. Nobody in that room knew that Blake Foster had also stood at an altar with 3 other women in 3 other states. Nobody knew that he'd whispered promises he had no intention of keeping. Nobody knew that within 8 weeks, Evelyn would be dead, and Blake would be gone. Clara left the reception early, claiming a headache. She drove back to her apartment in Oak Lawn and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop. She pulled up the death records she'd found weeks before. 3 women in 4 years. 3 different states. 3 different causes of death, each ruled as natural. She tried calling her mother again, but the call went to voicemail. Evelyn and Blake had left for their honeymoon in Cancun, Mexico that evening. Clara left a message. "Mom, I love you. Please call me when you get back. We need to talk. It's important." She hung up, knowing her mother probably wouldn't call back. But what she didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Blake was already planning her mother's death. That while Evelyn was celebrating her marriage on a beach in Cancun, Blake was researching her heart medication. He was learning the names, the dosages, the effects of taking them versus not taking them. He was learning exactly how long it would take for her body to fail without proper pharmaceutical support. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he was already thinking about the next woman. The next target, the next chance to play this game all over again. But first, he had to make sure Evelyn Winters disappeared without raising any questions. He had to make sure her death looked like something nobody needed to investigate. He had to make sure that, by the time Clara figured out the truth, he was already gone, with millions of dollars and a new identity in a place where she'd never find him. The man that Evelyn Winters married in October 2019 wasn't the man she thought she knew. Blake Foster had been married before. 4 times, in fact. The first was a woman named Dorothy Chen, married in 2010 in Arizona under the name Michael Harrison. Dorothy was 64 years old when she met Blake. She owned a successful real estate company and had no close family to speak of. By August 2011, just 10 months into their marriage, Dorothy suffered a sudden heart attack at home. Blake was there. He called emergency services immediately. He played the devastated husband perfectly. She left him her estate, valued at approximately $4 million. Then Blake disappeared from Arizona, resurfaced in Nevada under a different name, and started hunting for his next target. The second was Patricia Mullins, married in 2014 in Reno under the name David Sterling. Patricia was 68, a retired pharmaceutical executive with substantial wealth and a daughter who lived on the opposite coast. Patricia died in November 2014, just 9 months into their marriage. The official cause was complications from a fall down the stairs. Blake was the sole beneficiary of her $2.8 million estate. He stayed long enough to collect the money, then he vanished again. The third was Margaret Holbrook. Not related to Evelyn's friend Margaret, but coincidentally sharing the same first name. Married in Denver in 2016 under the name Robert Coleman. Margaret was 59, a widow with $3 million in assets and minimal family contact. She died in June 2017 after what the medical examiner ruled as a natural cardiac event. 8 months of marriage. $3 million to Blake. No investigation, no suspicion, just another grieving widower who disappeared into the night with a fortune. And now, there was Evelyn. The pattern was unmistakable if you were looking for it. But Evelyn wasn't looking. She was in love with a man who had successfully eliminated 3 women without raising the suspicion of a single investigator. When Blake and Evelyn returned from their honeymoon in Cancun on October 22, 2019, Blake immediately began the third phase of his operation. The first phase was selection and seduction. The second was financial integration. The third was elimination. On October 25, 2019, Blake suggested that they consolidate Evelyn's financial accounts to make things easier. "It's simpler if we have everything together," he said casually over coffee in their shared home, the beautiful house in Highland Park that Evelyn had owned for 15 years. "That way, if anything ever happens, we can manage things seamlessly. No complications, no bureaucracy." Evelyn, still euphoric from her honeymoon and trusting her new husband completely, agreed. Over the next 2 weeks, Blake added himself as a beneficiary to her life insurance policy, which paid out $1.5 million. He added himself as a joint owner on her bank accounts containing over $2 million. He convinced her to update her will, naming him as the executor and primary beneficiary of her entire estate, estimated at $8.4 million. Each transaction felt reasonable. Each step seemed logical for a married couple planning a future together. Each signature she made seemed like an act of love. And by November 8, 2019, Blake Foster had legal access to everything Evelyn Winters had spent 38 years building. He had given her something in return. Himself. It was a bargain she believed would last forever. She had no idea it would only last 6 weeks. Evelyn had been managing a heart condition for 6 years. She took 3 medications daily to keep her condition stable. A beta blocker called metoprolol, which helped regulate her heart rate and prevent arrhythmia. An ACE inhibitor called lisinopril, which controlled her blood pressure and protected her cardiac function. And aspirin, a blood thinner to prevent clots that could lead to stroke or heart attack. The medications worked. Her cardiologist had praised her diligence. She never missed a dose. She set phone reminders. She kept her prescriptions organized in a pill organizer that she filled every Sunday morning with military precision. Blake noticed all of this. He observed her routine. He studied her habits. He learned that at 7 in the morning, before anything else, she took her medications with a glass of water. On November 10, 2019, 2 days before he began his final operation, Blake ordered a bottle of pharmaceutical-grade inert tablets online. They were identical-looking placebos that would pass any visual inspection. They cost him $43. They arrived 3 days later in a plain brown box. Starting on November 12, 2019, Blake began a slow substitution. Each morning, when Evelyn took her medications, Blake would hand them to her or watch her take them. But the pills weren't her real medications. They were useless placebos. He replaced them systematically, day by day, so that by November 18th, Evelyn was no longer taking any of the medications she depended on. She had no way of knowing. The pills looked identical. They tasted the same. They were the same size and shape. Her body, however, began to respond immediately to their absence. Without the beta blocker, her heart rate became irregular. Without the ACE inhibitor, her blood pressure started to climb dangerously. Without the aspirin, her blood became slightly more prone to clotting. Blake watched these changes with clinical detachment. He was waiting for the cascade of events that would lead to her death. He was waiting for her heart to fail. By November 20, 2019, Evelyn began to feel unwell in ways she couldn't quite explain. She was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. She felt slight shortness of breath when she walked up the stairs to their bedroom. She felt her heart racing at odd moments, even when she was sitting still. She mentioned these symptoms to Blake one evening as they sat on their couch. He was immediately attentive. "You should rest more," he said gently, stroking her hair. "You've been working so hard. You've spent decades pushing yourself. Take a few days off from the office. Let me take care of you." She did. She took 3 days off from her business. She sent emails to her staff saying she wasn't feeling well and would be working from home. Blake brought her tea in bed. He made her soup from scratch. He was the perfect attentive husband. What Evelyn didn't know was that he was watching her deteriorate. He was checking her color, her breathing, her energy levels. He was waiting for the moment when her weakened heart would fail under the strain of its own dysfunction. Clara called on November 22, 2019. She was still concerned, still unable to shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. "How are you feeling, Mom?" she asked carefully, trying to keep her voice neutral. Evelyn sounded tired on the phone, exhausted in a way that Clara had never heard before. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little rundown. Blake thinks I should take better care of myself, rest more. He's been wonderful about it. He's taking such good care of me." Clara's alarm bells were ringing so loudly she could barely focus. "Mom, I need you to listen to me carefully. I've been investigating Blake's background, and I found something very important. He's been married before, multiple times, and every single one of his wives died within a year of marrying him." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Evelyn said quietly, her voice tight, "Clara, that's insane. You're making serious accusations about a man you barely know based on what? Coincidence? Suspicion?" Clara tried to explain about the death records, the different names, the pattern, but Evelyn wasn't listening anymore. "I'm hanging up," she said firmly. "I'm hanging up because you're being paranoid and cruel. Blake is a good man. He loves me, and I'm not going to let you poison this." The call ended. Clara tried 3 more times that day. Evelyn didn't answer. By November 26, 2019, Evelyn felt noticeably worse. Her heart was racing irregularly, skipping beats, then compensating with forceful surges. She was experiencing sharp pains in her chest when she moved too quickly. She was short of breath from simple activities like walking to the kitchen or getting dressed. She looked pale. She looked sick in a way that transcended normal exhaustion. Blake insisted on staying home with her. He told her that work didn't matter, that her business could wait. What mattered was her health. What he didn't tell her was that he was waiting for the final cascade, the moment when her weakened cardiac system would catastrophically fail. On the evening of November 27, 2019, a Wednesday, Blake prepared dinner. Evelyn had mentioned weeks ago that she wanted homemade pasta. He made it from scratch. He made a salad. He opened a bottle of wine. They sat at their dining room table, candlelit like so many evenings had been, and he watched her try to eat. She was struggling. She had no appetite. She pushed the food around her plate. By 8:45 in the evening, she excused herself to the bathroom. When she returned, her face was visibly pale. She sat back down and took a sip of water. Blake reached across the table and took her hand. His touch was gentle. His expression was concerned. "I love you," he said, his voice soft and tender. "I know," she replied. It would be one of the last conversations they would have. At approximately 9:15 in the evening, on November 27, 2019, Evelyn felt a crushing sensation in her chest. The pain was intense and radiating, spreading from her sternum into her arms and her jaw. She gasped. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't respond properly. She looked at Blake with confusion and fear in her eyes. "Something's wrong," she said, her voice shaking. "I can't breathe. I can't. Blake's response was immediate and practiced. He didn't panic. He didn't fumble. He didn't look shocked. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. His voice, when the operator answered, was perfectly calibrated to sound alarmed but controlled. "My wife is experiencing chest pain and difficulty breathing," he said calmly, clearly, as if he were reporting a minor inconvenience. "She has a history of heart disease. Please send an ambulance to our address immediately. She's in severe distress." He provided the address. He told them her name. He told them her age. He told them she took medications for her heart. He sounded like a man desperately trying to save his wife's life. What he actually was, a man watching her die and ensuring that nobody would suspect foul play. The ambulance arrived at 9:32 in the evening. The paramedics found Evelyn on the floor of their dining room, Blake kneeling beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his expression one of deep concern. "Her heart," he was saying as they burst through the door. "Please, you have to help her. I think she's having a heart attack." The paramedics worked quickly with the efficiency of professionals who knew they were fighting against time. They got her on a stretcher. They placed her on supplemental oxygen. They established an IV line. They performed an EKG right there in the living room, watching the erratic patterns on the monitor. One paramedic asked Blake about her medications. "She takes metoprolol, lisinopril, and aspirin," he said immediately, his voice steady and factual. "She's been very good about taking them, every morning without fail, and as far as I know, she hasn't missed a dose." He was right about what she was supposed to be taking. He'd simply made sure she wasn't. The ambulance pulled away from the house at 9:38, sirens wailing through the Dallas night. Blake rode with her. He held her hand. He whispered reassurances. "You're going to be okay," he told her, his voice tender and loving. "We're going to get through this together. Just hold on." But they weren't going to get through it together. Evelyn Winter's heart had been without its critical medications for nearly 2 weeks. Her cardiac system was in a state of acute failure. Her heart rate was dangerously irregular. Her blood pressure was critically elevated. The ambulance arrived at Baylor University Medical Center at 9:51 in the evening. Evelyn was rushed directly to the emergency department. Doctors and nurses surrounded her, a coordinated team working with the urgency of people who knew they were fighting against time. They administered medications through her IV. They performed an EKG. They took blood samples and ran them through machines. They attempted to stabilize her vital signs, but there was nothing they could do. Her heart had been without the medications it needed to function for too long. At 10:17 in the evening on November 27, 2019, her heart stopped. Despite the best efforts of the medical team, despite their skill and their determination, they couldn't restart it. They worked for 14 minutes. At 10:31 in the evening, Evelyn Winters was pronounced dead. The official cause of death was acute myocardial infarction, a heart attack. She was 60 years old. She had been married for less than 7 weeks. Blake, standing in the hospital waiting room, received the news with perfect composure. His face arranged itself into an expression of shock and devastation. A nurse offered him a tissue. He took it. He wiped his eyes, careful not to smudge his contacts. He asked in a shaking voice, "Can I see her?" They let him. He sat beside his dead wife for 5 minutes. He held her hand one final time. He whispered something that nobody would ever hear. Then he stood, straightened his suit jacket, and walked out of the hospital. Before the sun came up, he would have called the hospital's probate attorney. He would have begun the process of claiming her estate. He would have started planning his disappearance. Within hours, the $8.4 million would be within his reach. Within days, he would be gone. And nobody, not the doctors, not the nurses, not even Clara, would have any way of knowing what he'd done. Not yet. Clara received the call from the hospital at 11:12 in the evening. A hospital administrator with a sympathetic voice explaining that her mother had suffered a massive cardiac event, that despite their best efforts, she hadn't survived. That she was terribly sorry for her loss. Clara dropped the phone. She fell to her knees on her kitchen floor. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She couldn't do anything but feel the weight of what she knew crushing down on her. And even in her devastation, even in the shock of losing her mother to what appeared to be natural causes, a single thought crystallized in her mind with absolute certainty. He did this. She didn't know how. She didn't know how he could have done it so perfectly that even the hospital saw nothing wrong. But she knew, with the same certainty that had guided her detective's instincts all along, that Blake Foster had murdered her mother. She had 3 weeks to figure out how to prove it. 3 weeks before the official investigation would be closed. 3 weeks before Blake would inherit everything and vanish without a trace. And she was determined that those 3 weeks would be enough. Because Evelyn Winter's daughter was about to become something far more dangerous than a detective. She was about to become a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The funeral service for Evelyn Winters was held on December 5, 2019, at Highland Park United Methodist Church. The sanctuary was full. More than 200 people came to say goodbye. Her employees, her clients, her friends, her business associates, people whose lives she'd touched through her work, her vision, her strength. Blake Foster sat in the front row, dressed in an immaculate black suit. His eyes were red. His expression was devastated. He held a tissue in his hand. He accepted condolences with the grace of a man shattered by loss. He spoke about Evelyn with genuine-sounding affection. "She was the strongest woman I've ever known," he said during the reception, his voice breaking slightly. "I feel blessed that I got to know her, even if it was only for a short time. She changed my life." People embraced him. They told him she was lucky to have had him. They told him that love like theirs was rare and beautiful. Clara stood in the back corner of the church, watching him perform. She watched the way his grief was perfectly timed, the way his tears came at exactly the right moments, the way he paused before speaking as if gathering himself. She'd been trained to observe human behavior. She'd been trained to see the inconsistencies between what people said and what they actually felt. And what she saw in Blake Foster's performance made her skin crawl. This wasn't grief. This was theater. On December 6, 2019, the morning after the funeral, Clara walked into the Dallas Police Department's headquarters on South Lamar Street. She went directly to her supervisor's office. Captain Michael Chen listened as she explained what she needed. "I want to request a toxicology report on my mother," she said, keeping her voice professional despite the weight in her chest. "I know the cause of death was ruled as myocardial infarction, but I need to rule out other factors. I need to be thorough." Captain Chen leaned back in his chair. He knew Clara. He respected her, but he also knew the protocol. "Clara, your mother had a documented heart condition." The hospital performed an EKG. The symptoms were consistent with cardiac failure. "There's not really grounds for a full toxicology without evidence of foul play. You understand that, right?" Clara met his gaze directly. "I have evidence of potential foul play. Or at least, I have a strong suspicion based on my mother's medical history and some inconsistencies I've discovered in my husband's background. I'm asking for the test. My mother's blood is still in the hospital system. Let me request it, please." Something in her voice, the certainty, the controlled desperation, made Captain Chen pause. "I'll make the call," he said quietly. "But Clara, you need to understand something. If you pursue this and it comes back showing nothing unusual, you need to accept it. You need to let your mother rest. You can't let suspicion become obsession." Clara nodded. She said she understood. She didn't mean it. By December 10, 2019, the toxicology report was complete. Clara sat at her desk with the results in front of her, and the numbers told a story that made everything clear. Metoprolol, 0.8 nanograms per milliliter. The therapeutic range for someone taking the medication daily should be between 50 and 100 nanogram milliliters. Lisinopril, 1.2 nanograms per milliliter, when the therapeutic range should be between 10 and 100 nanograms per milliliter. Aspirin, below detection level. Clara read those numbers 3 times, her hands growing colder with each reading. Her mother had essentially no medication in her system when she died. Not some. Not a reduced amount. No medication at all, which meant she hadn't been taking her medications, or someone had deliberately made sure she wasn't taking them. Clara picked up the phone and called the hospital's toxicology department. She spoke with Dr. Patricia Sanchez, the senior toxicologist who'd run the test. Dr. Sanchez, I'm calling about the toxicology results on Evelyn Winters. The cardiac medication levels seem unusually low. Can you walk me through what these numbers mean? Dr. Sanchez's voice on the phone was professional but careful. Detective Winters, the levels you're looking at are consistent with someone not taking their prescribed medications. The half-life of metoprolol is about 3 to 7 hours. The half-life of lisinopril is about 12 hours. What we're seeing in your mother's blood suggests she hadn't been taking either medication for at least 7 to 10 days before her death. Clara asked the critical question. Is there any way she could have accidentally missed taking them? Any way this could be explained by negligence on her part? There was a pause on the other end of the line. I would say highly unlikely. Your mother's levels weren't just low, they were essentially non-existent. That's not someone who forgot to take a few doses. That's someone who wasn't taking them at all. And given her documented diligence with her medications, given that she had a pill organizer and set reminders, the most logical explanation is that someone deliberately removed her medications or replaced them with placebos. Clara thanked Dr. Sanchez and hung up the phone. She sat in her car in the hospital parking lot for 20 minutes and allowed herself to cry. Then she went to work. Over the next week, Clara became someone different. She stopped sleeping more than a few hours a night. She stopped eating regular meals. She stopped answering calls from friends who were checking on her. She focused entirely on one objective, proving that Blake Foster had murdered her mother. She started with internet searches at her desk during her shifts, pulling up death records and obituaries nationwide. She searched for Blake Foster in databases from coast to coast. She found nothing. Then she searched for Michael Harrison, the first alias she knew about. The Arizona death records showed Dorothy Chen, age 64, married to Michael Harrison in 2010. Cause of death? Acute myocardial infarction. She found the article in the Arizona Republic. It was brief, just a few paragraphs. A wealthy real estate executive's unexpected heart failure attributed to pre-existing cardiac condition. No investigation, no questions asked. She searched for David Sterling in Nevada records. She found Patricia Mullins, age 68, married to David Sterling in 2014. Cause of death, complications from a fall down a flight of stairs. There was a small mention in the Reno Gazette-Journal. A recent widow had an accident at home. No investigation. She searched Robert Coleman in Denver death records. She found Margaret Holbrook, age 59, married to Robert Coleman in 2016. Cause of death, natural cardiac event. Again, nothing remarkable. Just another death. Just another grieving widower who collected his inheritance and disappeared. But when Clara looked at all 4 cases together, when she lined them up chronologically and geographically, the pattern became unmistakable. 4 women, 4 different aliases, 4 different states, all married within months of meeting their husbands. All died within a year of marriage. All had significant financial estates. All had limited family connections who might ask questions. Clara made a spreadsheet in Excel on her personal laptop at home. She listed each victim, their ages, their estimated wealth, the duration of their marriages, the official cause of death, the inheritance amounts Blake had received. When she was done, she stared at the numbers. Dorothy Chen, $3.2 million. Patricia Mullins, $2.8 million. Margaret Holbrook, $3 million. Evelyn Winters, $8.4 million. Over $17 million. Blake Foster had methodically murdered 4 women across 4 years and collected over $17 million in the process. On December 14, 2019, Clara contacted law enforcement in Arizona, Nevada, and Colorado. She submitted formal requests for case files related to Dorothy Chen's death in Phoenix, Patricia Mullen's death in Reno, and Margaret Holbrook's death in Denver. She provided the information she discovered about the pattern. She explained the different aliases. She documented the timeline. She outlined the financial motive. The responses came slowly. Agencies that had closed cases years ago weren't immediately prepared to reopen them, based on a phone call from a detective in Texas. But on December 16, 2019, a detective from Phoenix named Robert Hernandez called Clara back at the Dallas Police Department. "Detective Winters, I've reviewed the file on Dorothy Chen's death from 2011. I've also reviewed some of the other files you mentioned. I have to tell you, what you're presenting is genuinely compelling, but it's going to be difficult to prove without more concrete evidence. These cases were all closed years ago. The bodies may have been cremated. The original investigators have moved on or retired. You're talking about exhuming bodies, ordering new toxicology tests, going through records that may no longer be readily available." Clara understood the obstacles. "I know it's difficult, but I have fresh evidence. I have a current toxicology from Dallas that shows my mother had no cardiac medication in her system when she died. I have a pattern across multiple states and multiple years. I have a clear financial motive, and I have a suspect who is actively trying to disappear with millions of dollars." On December 18, 2019, Blake Foster made his move. He went to Evelyn's bank and withdrew $80,000 in cash. He liquidated investment accounts. He cashed out retirement funds, paying the penalties without hesitation. He transferred assets to accounts in his own name. He withdrew money from Evelyn's safe deposit box, taking her jewelry, her important documents, anything of value. He purchased a one-way ticket from Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport to Panama City, departing on December 20th at 8:30 in the morning. He had forged travel documents ready. He had a new identity prepared under the name Richard Morrison. He had a plan to disappear, and he was executing it with the same precision he'd used to kill his wives. But what Blake Foster didn't know was that Clara had already alerted the airport authority about his potential flight. What he didn't know was that Captain Chen had authorized surveillance on his bank transactions and his movements. What he didn't know was that the Texas Rangers had become involved, treating this as a potential serial murder case across state lines. On December 20th, 2019, at 6:45 in the morning, Blake Foster arrived at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport with a small suitcase and a backpack. He was wearing jeans and a button-down shirt. His hair was different, shorter, dyed darker, from what it had been at Evelyn's funeral. He carried a new driver's license showing the name Richard Morrison. He carried a forged passport under that same name. He walked to the ticket counter at Terminal D. He was checking in for his flight to Panama, barely speaking to the attendant, trying to move through the process as quickly as possible. That's when the hand grabbed his arm. Uniformed officers surrounded him, their movements coordinated and efficient. One of them was Clara. She was watching his face when they said the words, "Blake Foster, you're under arrest for the murder of Evelyn Winters." Blake's face went pale. His mouth opened and closed like he was trying to form words, but couldn't remember how language worked. For the first time since anyone had known him, his performance broke completely. The charm disappeared. The carefully constructed persona cracked open and revealed what was underneath. What emerged was something cold, something furious, something utterly without remorse. "You can't prove anything," he said, his voice low and angry, no longer the tender tone he'd used with Evelyn. "You don't have evidence. You have suspicions. And suspicions don't hold up in court. My lawyer will have me out by this afternoon." He was technically correct. They didn't have ironclad evidence yet. Not the kind that would definitively hold up during trial. Not the kind that would convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. But Clara stepped forward. She was close enough to see the small muscle in his jaw clench. She was close enough to see the rage burning in his eyes. She was close enough to hear every word when she said, "We have your victim's toxicology report. We have the pattern across 3 states and 4 dead women. And we have law enforcement from Arizona, Nevada, and Colorado opening new investigations into the deaths of Dorothy Chen, Patricia Mullins, and Margaret Holbrook. You thought you could just walk away. You thought you'd already won. But you didn't count on my mother raising a daughter who wouldn't accept the official story. Blake was handcuffed. His rights were read to him. He was placed in a police vehicle. As the car pulled away from the airport terminal and merged into Dallas traffic, Clara watched it disappear. She stood in the Terminal D vestibule, surrounded by Christmas decorations and holiday travelers, and she felt something shift inside her. The initial rage had sustained her through the investigation. The obsessive need for justice had driven her forward. But now, knowing that Blake was finally in custody, knowing that the hunt was over, she felt the weight of what she'd proven settle across her shoulders. Blake Foster had murdered not just her mother, but 3 other women. He'd gotten away with it for years because the system hadn't been looking. He'd only been caught because her mother had raised a daughter who refused to accept the official story. The case was far from over. The trial would be months away. There would be legal battles and challenges, and Blake would fight with every expensive lawyer he could hire. He would claim innocence, he would file motions and appeals, he would try every legal maneuver available to him. But Clara knew something that Blake didn't yet realize. She knew that toxicology doesn't lie. She knew that a pattern of murders repeated across state lines couldn't be explained away as coincidence. She knew that when the families of Dorothy Chen and Patricia Mullins and Margaret Holbrook learned the truth about what had happened to their loved ones, they would become allies in the fight for justice. They would testify. They would demand answers. They would push for accountability. Blake Foster had finally met someone smarter than him. He had finally encountered a detective who wouldn't accept a convenient story or a death ruled natural. And he had finally discovered what all predators eventually learn, that they always leave traces. It just takes someone willing to look hard enough to find them. The trial of Blake Foster began on March 16, 2020, in the Frank Crowley Courts building in downtown Dallas. Judge Patricia Morrison presided over the case. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and the families of Blake's victims. Dorothy Chen's daughter sat in the 3rd row. Patricia Mullins' sister sat beside her. Margaret Holbrook's son and his wife were present as well. Evelyn's friends and business associates filled the remaining seats. Blake entered wearing a tailored suit, his hair styled perfectly, his expression composed. But something had changed since his arrest. The mask was thinner now. The performance was more calculated because he knew people were watching for inconsistencies. His attorney, a high-powered defense lawyer named Richard Thornton, had instructed him on courtroom behavior. Look sad but not devastated. Appear confused but not guilty. Maintain eye contact with jurors to seem sincere. The prosecution's case was straightforward and devastating. They presented Evelyn's toxicology report first. The numbers on the screen showed medication levels that were virtually non-existent. The prosecution's medical expert, Dr. Thomas Bedford, a cardiologist from UT Southwestern Medical Center, testified about what those numbers meant. Without metoprolol, her heart rate becomes irregular, Dr. Bedford explained, his voice clear and authoritative. Without lisinopril, her blood pressure elevates dangerously, and without aspirin, her blood becomes prone to clotting. Together, these 3 conditions create a cascade that leads to myocardial infarction. In a patient with her pre-existing cardiac condition, this combination is essentially fatal. Her death was not an accident, it was orchestrated. The prosecution then presented evidence of Blake's financial motive. They showed the life insurance policies, the beneficiary changes, the updated will. They showed the bank accounts that had been liquidated after Evelyn's death. They showed the forged travel documents and the one-way ticket to Panama. They presented financial records from Arizona, Nevada, and Colorado showing identical patterns with Blake's previous victims. Then they presented the testimony that changed everything. Clara took the stand on March 17, 2020. She was sworn in. She stated her name and her profession, and then she began to tell the story of her investigation. She described finding the death records for Dorothy Chen, Patricia Mullins, and Margaret Holbrook. She described the pattern she'd discovered: 4 women, 4 deaths, 4 inheritances. She detailed the timeline. She explained how she'd contacted law enforcement in other states. She described the toxicology report and what it revealed. And as she spoke, Blake's composure began to crack. His jaw clenched. His eyes darkened. He whispered something to his attorney, who placed a hand on his arm to quiet him. When Clara finished her testimony, the prosecution called the families of Blake's previous victims. Dorothy Chen's daughter, Margaret Chen, took the stand. Through tears, she described how her mother had seemed so happy after meeting Michael Harrison. How quickly the relationship had moved. How shocked everyone was when Dorothy died of a heart attack. How guilty Margaret felt for not having protected her. She looked directly at Blake when she spoke. He did the same thing to my mother that he did to Evelyn Winters. He murdered her and stole her money and walked away like it meant nothing. Patricia Mullins' sister, Diane Mullins Rogers, testified next. She described Patricia's fall, which she'd always felt was suspicious. She described how quickly Patricia's will had been changed. She described finding records of David Sterling's disappearance immediately after Patricia's death. I knew something was wrong, Diane said, her voice steady. But I didn't know what. Now I know. That man at that table murdered my sister. Margaret Holbrook's son, James, testified about his mother's cardiac event. He described how healthy she'd been before marrying Robert Coleman. He described the rapid changes in her will. He described his mother's life insurance policy being changed to make Coleman the beneficiary. He described his family's attempts to investigate her death being blocked by the authorities who'd ruled it natural causes. When James pointed at Blake, Blake's face twisted with anger. For the first time, the jury saw the real Blake Foster beneath the performance. The defense presented their case on March 20, 2020. Blake's attorney argued that the evidence was circumstantial. He argued that Evelyn could have accidentally stopped taking her medications. He argued that the pattern across other states was coincidence, not conspiracy. He argued that Blake's financial interests in his wife's estate was normal for a married couple. He presented Blake's testimony. Blake sat on the stand and told a story of love and grief. He claimed he'd tried to encourage Evelyn to take her medications. He claimed he'd had no knowledge of her not taking them. He claimed he'd been devastated by her death. He claimed the accusations from other families were based on grief and anger, not facts. He maintained his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence against him. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned to the courtroom on March 21, 2020, at 4:17 in the afternoon, the foreman handed the verdict to the judge. Judge Morrison read the verdict silently, her expression unreadable. Then she read it aloud. On the charge of murder in the first degree of Evelyn Winters, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted. Some people gasped, others wept. Clara sat with her hands covering her mouth. The foreman continued. On the charge of financial exploitation, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of wire fraud related to the life insurance policy, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of tampering with medication resulting in death, we find the defendant guilty. With each guilty verdict, Blake's face transformed. The performance dropped completely. What remained was pure rage. His hands clenched into fists. He stood abruptly and pointed at the jury. "You don't know anything," he said loudly. "You're all idiots. You're going to regret this." Judge Morrison banged her gavel. "Mr. Foster, sit down." But Blake continued. "She was nothing. All of them were nothing. Old women with money and no one to care about them. I gave them what they wanted. I gave them love. And they deserved what they got." The courtroom fell silent. The mask was completely gone. What everyone saw was the true Blake Foster. A man without remorse. A man without empathy. A man who saw other human beings as nothing more than targets for exploitation. At the sentencing hearing on April 2, 2020, Judge Morrison addressed Blake directly. "Mr. Foster, you have been found guilty of multiple counts of murder, financial fraud, and conspiracy. You have shown no remorse for your crimes. You have demonstrated contempt for this court and for the families you victimized. The sentences imposed on you today will ensure that you spend the remainder of your life incarcerated. Life without the possibility of parole on all counts. Multiple consecutive sentences. You will never leave prison. You will never see freedom again. Blake was led away in handcuffs. He didn't speak. He didn't look at the families. He simply disappeared into the system that would contain him for the rest of his life. Clara stood in the hallway outside the courtroom afterward. Dorothy Chen's daughter approached her. They embraced without words. Then Patricia Mullen's sister. Then Margaret Holbrook's son. 4 women were dead, but their families had finally received justice. In a press conference later that day, Clara made a statement. My mother made a choice based on loneliness. Blake Foster made a choice based on greed. My mother wanted companionship in her final years. Blake Foster wanted money and power. He exploited her vulnerability. He manipulated her love. He murdered her. But in doing so, he also created the circumstances for his own capture. Because he didn't count on my mother raising a daughter who would refuse to accept a convenient story. Clara paused, looking directly at the cameras. To anyone watching this, I want you to understand something. Predators like Blake Foster exist in our society. They target vulnerability. They look for older women who are lonely, who are isolated, who are desperate for connection. The warning signs are there if you know what to look for. A relationship that moves too quickly. Behavior that's too perfect, too polished, too rehearsed. Someone who wants to control your finances. Someone who isolates you from family and friends. Someone who needs to manage your medical care. These are not signs of love. These are signs of predation. Notice them. Protect the people you love. Believe your instincts. Evelyn Winter's death was a tragedy. But her legacy doesn't end in that hospital room. Her legacy is this trial. Her legacy is Blake Foster in prison for the rest of his life. Her legacy is the warning I'm giving you right now. Notice the patterns. Protect each other. Because speaking for the dead is the most important justice we can achieve. Evelyn would want her story to save someone else's life. Thank you for watching this documentary to the very end. Stories like Evelyn are difficult to hear, but they are important to share. It protect people, educate communities, they saved lives. If this story impacted you, please remember to like this video, subscribe our channel for more investigating documentaries, and share this with people you care about. Your share can reach to someone who needs to hear this message. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Also tell from which part of the world are currently watched in the comment below. I mean your location. Let's build a community to protect each. Stay safe.